Welcome to another interactive session with corporate executives, industry experts, and influential people in our society. Today, I have a very special guest with me, and he is very calm, collected, handsome, charming, but very intelligent individual. And his name is Zion Adeoye. He's the managing director of the Centurion Law Group, one of the largest law firms in Africa with offices scattered across the African continent and also listed on the German Stock Exchange.
Thank you, Michael. Zion Adeoye, as you've already introduced, a lawyer specializing in the energy sector. Well, unlike many lawyers or professionals, I think I've always had interest in the energy sector, specifically the oil and gas sector. So I started, in 2009 with the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation as a couple then, the National Youth Service, and proceeded to work in a number of, establishments, law firms. Also had a brief spell at KPMG and a couple of law firms in Nigeria focused on energy, oil and gas. So I've always had that interest, and the interest was because I felt that was one thing that, could drive the growth of Africa. Even as a student in the secondary school, I, wrote essays about what I wanted to do in future, and I always wanted to be a lawyer and, an oil and gas lawyer for some reason. So, yeah, I guess that interest led me to seek out opportunities that were, particularly targeted at that. And, looking back about 15 years now in the legal profession, I'm happy about the level of impact I've been able to have, in the oil and gas sector.
Fantastic. Having young leaders like you in Africa, spells out hope for a lot of the African youth. Looking at people like yourselves thriving and putting together, legal structures to develop Africa. That's a thing that I'd say it's uncommon, but perhaps we are beginning to see the trend of young leaders like yourself taking up the mantle and moving things across the continent. And that's, I'm sure, to the viewers and to your mentors, to people that view you as a mentor out there, this is something very satisfactory. So, Dan, what can you say currently about the energy crisis in South Africa and Nigeria? To the naive people out there, we don't necessarily understand what is happening so much. All we see is there's no energy. All we see is there's load shedding. All we see is there's insufficient electricity. What can you just say in a short summary of what really is going on in South Africa and Nigeria?
I think before I get to that, let me backtrack to what you mentioned about being young and having the opportunity. I think in reality, no one really takes the mantle. The mantle will be given. To some extent, I was lucky in industry to have mentors and to have seniors and employers who believed in young people. I must mention, one of my biggest mentors, Professor Yinka Murube, who as my dean of the faculty and also as my boss and also, legal director and NPC gave me opportunities, even as a young professional, down to the extent that there was that exposure to the industry. Many people are not that lucky, and it's important to mention that also. Adeoye was the CEO of Centurion Law Group, and having people like that that believe in younger people and allow them to thrive, allow them to make their shares mistake is very important. And I think across the continent that's one thing that is missing, and that's why a lot of young people are not able to attain positions. Now you say I'm young, but I'm not young. I'm almost 40. Perhaps that's young, in Africa, because we've always made youth leaders of tomorrow, not today, where they're most active and thriving. But I must say that those people who I've worked with, several other organizations, not so many I would mention, but that opportunity has led to what I've been able to achieve, today. Now, getting to your question, I think there's no argument for the fact that energy, is the feedstock for development, and the difference between developed nations and developing nations, and also underdeveloped nations, is the amount of energy they've been able to put to work, right. Over the years. Africa has never lacked the raw materials, the mineral resources, but we've always not had sufficient a system to put things in place for Africa. So most of our resources have been channeled out of the continent for centuries. And also, while not blaming the victim, we've also not played our part in cooperation and collaboration to ensure that African affairs, or Africa, as a structure, is able to thrive and compete with the rest of the world. There were times, past the colonial periods, where perhaps we did not have that opportunity or strength to be able to take our own content, in the global scheme of things. The way the world is wired today, we were never really at the table to determine how those things, happen. And when you're not at the table to determine how it's done, do not expect decisions or the system to be skewed right. In your favor. So coming down to what South Africa is experiencing, I think South Africa is experiencing what every other African system, experiences, which is a failure of leadership to continuously develop, a system. I think South Africa has been through its struggles and should actually be the best example from Africa. And as bad as the South African energy situation is now, it's unfortunate that's still one of the better examples. I lived in Nigeria, where I can count the days where there was actually power from what we call the mains, or from NEPA then, Electric Power Authority. We all had to produce our electricity by ourselves. The sound of generators, still ring in my ears, even though I lived in Nigeria for about 7 years.
Wow.
And the fact is, South Africa still has hope. You have a customer base which is used to paying for utilities. You have a fully developed, market, right. And with the right legislation and regulation, and also perhaps some sort of liberalization of the system. Right. You would allow players that can really make a difference to come into the power sector. You cannot legislate or incentivize away bad management and inefficiency. That's something that we've struggled with in Africa, we continue to struggle with. And we must have serious conversations with ourselves on how to deal with this. But there is hope. I think I think the government's taking it very seriously now and having the conversations. But you must have the right structures. Regulation, legislation, very important. Starts from policy, and then you have legislation, and then you have regulations to ensure that day to day you can be flexible enough to meet changing circumstances. So for South Africa, I think the story is still being written on the energy sector. But again, one thing is that South Africa would have to understand that its transition from coal, which forms at least 70% of its electricity generation or energy supply, would have to be done to perhaps natural gas. There's abundance of gas in Mozambique. South Africa does have its own as well. There's Namibia, and certainly there are, options for modular, sort of power ships, all sorts of things that can take advantage of. With the kind of market that South Africa has, which is crystallized already,
Right.
it should not, suffer what it's suffering in terms of load shedding or, whatever it's called over here. So I think with some level of dedication the government is showing, in the near future, I am actually optimistic that things will change.
Change. Absolutely. Well, that's a little bit of hope there from Zion. Zion, you touched on leadership here in Africa, and the issue of leadership seems to be a very interesting topic or conversation to touch on. You believe that Africa obviously has a very peculiar leadership challenge. Is there a hub do we require a hub to train future leaders? You've also touched on the potentials of gas in Mozambique and etc. But in Africa, we seem to have the problem of even trading amongst ourselves, and that's also another issue. Then we have the legal structures, which you touched on, that we need to have some proper, legal structures to guide, the implementation of some of these policies. But the legal structures here, Africa seems to have a lot of legal structures in place, but when it comes to enforcing these regulations is also another thing. Then we have the issue of corruption coming in, that people seem to, get away or around the law. They are untouchable, in quotes. And could that also be a challenge that's affecting this energy deficit? I mean, discipline, in a nutshell, seems to be the key word here. We are lacking this discipline, and that's really affecting us badly. What's your take on that?
Yeah, there are many aspects to that. I think taking it from the top, when it comes to the issue of corruption, what can combat corruption is systems that are set up and that cannot be easily rigged. There's no amount of anti-corruption laws or the executive, waking one day and saying, this administration is all about anti-corruption, which happens all the time, which is, just, I feel, a political gimmick used to get subscription from the electorate. That's not how it works. If you look at crystallized systems, developed nations, they have systems, it's not just about executive, it's about systems, that are set up and developed over long time, stress tested to the point where, they stand the test of time. So we need to start to focus on developing systems. What have you? I think as a lawyer, I feel the judiciary in Africa is perhaps failed. That's a very heavy word to use, but perhaps failed because redress for the systems, for political use of political power, even in the private sector, all that goes on can be had at the judiciary, but this is often lacking, and then the last resort for those who are concerned enough or affected enough to actually try to push back against system of corruption. Constant failure of that crop of people leads to a system where anything goes. So in terms of leadership, certainly I think there are leaders in the private sector, there are leaders in different circles, but the positioning has been really bad. We've not had good examples of leadership where it matters the most. Compared to when we were much younger or in the past. I think Africa did have leaders you could point to, Kwame Nkrumah, who grew up with those names, and we could. There were problems. Many of the people we deify had issues of bigotry and all that, and we have to be very honest with ourselves that we did have those issues, but in terms of what the youth could look forward to and emulate and imbibe, there was a lot more then back then than we have now. I think the fact that we do have a young population might actually be something that will help Africa. I mean, the average age in a country like Nigeria is about 19 years. So I think the youth are putting things together. You saw what happened in the recent elections, and but also there's opportunity, I always say, for leadership in the private sector. It's not until you become the president of a country that you can actually lead a revolution, a positive one that leads to some, positive change across the continent. And we also need to understand economics. We need to understand that Africa is not one country, but when the global affairs are being dealt, Africa is treated as that. So I think the pushback to gain ascendancy, as a continent must also be concerted. I always say the concept of shared prosperity is something that is missing for Africans.
I agree.
For African countries to aggregate and unite, I don't think it's from a kumbaya perspective. I think it makes business sense.
Yes.
Give an example. The US and China, if you watch CNN, you think, they have guns pointed at themselves every second. Perhaps they do, but they're each other's biggest trade partners.
Right.
And perhaps what, has precluded doom to this, the fact that if anything goes down, along those lines, all of that trade falls apart. They say the American dream is perhaps made in China. So we need to understand that. And if unwholesome tendencies will prevent us from doing business together, the issue of visa-free Africa should not be a problem. Though it's admittedly there should be more even development, across. But when you talk about GDP, when you talk about development, it's about human activity. So, what is the African GDP if Africans are bounded to their separate countries and cannot move around or prospect, across the continent? Right. I mean, the ability of a young European to prospect across the entire union, you cannot place a price on that.
Absolutely.
And that's also movement of people creating businesses, and business subscription across that system. So we have to understand why it is important. It's not just about leisure travel or immigration. There's a business perspective that and also the go it alone strategy, adopted by many countries across the continent, was a huge economic failure because we are wasting our natural monopolies. A country as small as Equatorial Guinea should not have a project that is, specifically for that country. There has to be a regional play where Cameroon, Nigeria, all subscribe to that project. Look at the entire region and say, we have gas here, you have gas, what can we do? I feel more of that's been done, but a lot has been wasted. And for as long as that investment comes into the country and, must be repatriated for you to, not have an expropriatory status, then, you are perhaps jeopardizing the future, finances of the country. So some of these conversations, I think African leaders, the business community, if the leaders are, doing their own thing, must be having to ensure that, there's an Africa play. They'll say, you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, you have to go together. Three, sector cord cannot be easily broken. That's just
absolutely.
The way it is.
I agree with that. Yeah. I agree with that. Speaking of the unification of Africa, we have I think, and I like your choice of words to say that we have to be able to call it upon ourselves. We have to speak frankly. I mean, some of these challenges have been there for a while, and I think we are not being honest to ourselves as Africans. They have the Africa peer review where we are supposed to, that's the purpose is supposed to be serving, where we're supposed to be able to call or tell it upon ourselves and say, look, you've been here in this leadership position for quite some time. You haven't done what you're supposed to do, but it seems that I don't know if it's the culture thing where we are afraid or shy. I don't know which one it is to point out honestly amongst our own peers or neighbors to say that you're not doing the right thing over there. And yes, we have had this issue of even amongst ourselves Africans where we are limited to move to other neighboring countries in Africa, but it's quite easier for even Europeans to visit, you know, and exploit business opportunities. Whereas, I mean, you have people from Ghana who have never been to South Africa. You have people from Nigeria who have never been to Mozambique. And if you look at it, it's probably because they probably require a visa, which is another process, you know, to do that. Do you believe that Africa at some point would unite in terms of economic integration, business, free borders? You think, because I know that if you look at the African Union, they have their Agenda 2063, and this is one of their key agendas to open borders. But this has been happening, Zion.
You know, it's not about what I think. I hope that what will force us to unite will not be, you know, abject.
Tell me more about that. I like to hear that.
Abject poverty within the continent. I mean, we talk about over 600 million people without electricity today in Africa. That's ridiculous with the level of oil and gas we have, with the level of, you know, technologies that have been deployed. It just shows the level, you know, and globally as well. It's a bad play because the world is, you know, perhaps not realizing its full potential, because Africa, not just the land, not just the resources, the human resources itself. You can see what, you know, immigration is happening in Canada, in Europe, you know, Nigerians, Cameroonians, and you know, Ghanaians, all that going there. Africa has got that content which the world needs. So it's not just about Africa, and perhaps there is a better world if Africa is able to you know, realize its potential.
Right.
For us, I think for Africa, there's always been what would I say, shackles of the mind, and we need to understand these things. As I said before, African cooperation makes economic sense, makes business sense. It's not just about the fact that we're black.
Right.
It's the fact that we are fighting the same things, you know.
The same battle.
Same battle. So uniting to surmount, you know, what the struggles are, you know, just makes sense, you know, basically makes sense. And until we realize that, until we actually put that in action, of course, the free continental trade, you know, agreement helps, but it should not just be a concept. It must be practicalized. You gave the example of Ghanaians who have not been to South Africa, and those Nigerians who have not been to Mozambique. It's not just about their travel, as I said. It's that's business. That's airlines are able to have, you know, more customers. There's also a lot of
infrastructure.
You know, so many things going on when that happens, when people move around. There's economic activity.
Absolutely.
And then results in the development of those areas where, you know, people are moving to, and there's opportunity for more collaboration, and also even for development of laws, because you have to do a stress test. You cannot just, for the fear of extreme immigration, decide to close your borders entirely. Then you close opportunities that, you know, could be seeds today for, you know. Also, I think we have to be bolder in our ambitions, because when I see African programs, you say the Africa we want to be perhaps in 2030 or 2050. You know, anything you set in, you know, 1994, 2025 would have been truncated by, you know, COVID.
True.
So we have to set bolder, shorter term goals and
realistic
collaborate.
ones.
You know, sometimes if your dreams do not scare you, you're not dreaming big enough. So
I agree.
The idea is you have to set targets, because you are speaking of a continent with resources, you know, which, you know, richest countries like DRC should be some of the most, you know, wealthiest countries in the world, some of the wealthiest countries in the world. And you see that the DRC GDP compared to Nigeria, South Africa is significantly low, and the level of development as well. So there's something wrong there. But activating that with regional play perhaps gives a better opportunity to gain the ascendancy, economic ascendancy necessary to compete in the world.
I agree, Zion. There's definitely something wrong over there. But this is where the thought-provoking question sets in, Ian. Our leadership. These are guys who are schooled, educated. These are guys who have traveled abroad, have seen developed countries. These are guys who themselves, some of them have been educated outside of Africa. Some of them own properties, use access the medical services in Europe, America, Canada, Australia, the rest of the world. But when it comes to, what I'm saying is these guys are knowledgeable. So I won't say they don't know the challenges that Africa has. They are aware. So then my question is it just the lack of will to develop the continent? Is it corruption? Is it selfishness? Is it that I don't care because I have made my wealth, I have secured my family, so I'm content and the rest can rot in hell? Is it the kind of mindset that we have as leadership in Africa? Because I don't seem to understand. Is the leadership, are they just short-sighted? Because they are aware. We complain every day. They are aware of the situation. They cannot be. They've studied about it. But when it comes to action, and I look at the policies, some of them, sometimes they put in place. But when it comes to, we are good on paper. In Africa, we are very good at writing and futuristic goals and policies and meetings and conferences. We are very good at that. And we discuss. But after the conference, after the meeting, we go back to our houses and everything seems to slow down. Do we need some sort of regulatory framework that would action us? I mean, you're a lawyer. Tell us about that, because I'm lost.
There are places where there's so many fundamental issues, and I'll take some of them. There are places where regulation can help. I'll give an example. South Africa is struggling with energy, and it's got gas. It's been battling in the courts regarding developing that gas. The reason why there's that battle, I'll just start briefly on that, is because there's no proper legislation to say this is the law of the land. We are developing our gas. We have energy needs and we must do that. There are places, but in so many respects, we do not need more laws or regulations. We need action. We need an understanding of what government is. There's the strategy management part of it and the risk management part of it that African nations have not really understood. For several industries, our biggest industries, we dole out incentives which are necessary for foreign investors to come. But I feel like governments many times in Africa do not do the bare minimum necessary. They do not put the skin in the game to activate, because it's a cliche, we will pays the piper dictates the tune. There's opportunity to be bigger partners in the development of a country, because every country in Africa is seeking for foreign investments, and foreign investments necessary, but we've not been able to use what we have internally to have more stake, more equity in that development, so that those structures are not just created to repatriate, so we remain perpetually in a repatriation scenario. And now it's gone to the excess where, Africa's in debt, for generations to come if nothing changes. Other fundamental issues, I mentioned before that when the decision of how the system of the world will work, when those decisions were being made, Africa has not been at the table. And I think with in renewed understanding, flow of information, and the resources we have genuinely, Africa needs to go back to that table and say, now we're at that table, so and so. We live, I always say, we live in a rock, paper, scissors world where paper, covers rock. So the US dollar matters more than the gold that South Africa and DRC, have, combined. And think about the resources in Africa, that cannot be overemphasized. So we need to reset what we have against the world. We need to combine our strategies. We need to combine our strengths,
Right.
and re-engage with the world. Sometimes some of this is about having that conversation and insisting. We've had several conferences and whatever that mark the direction of the world.
Right.
Africa needs to engineer a new conference that says this continent is important to the world for the foreseeable future. The least polluter of the environment, one of the richest in natural resources. This play does not work. And have that conversation and, be serious about it and start to re-engineer a world, that favors Africa. Because we're so far behind, I do not think that, individual successes, and perhaps that's a bit pessimistic, will be sufficient to
get us where we want to go.
Engender, some sort of ascendancy, economic, which is important for. I mean, the economic justice part of the world must still come to play. So there are a number of fundamental issues. On the issue of leadership, I think clearly we do not have the stock of leadership that. But I say, do not look at leadership in the public sphere alone. Private sector leadership. I see that's going on, especially in the information technology age. A lot of young people. At one time I was in KPMG, and so many of my colleagues are leaders of fintech, very thriving, very successful, and that's encouraging to say. These are still very young people, 30, between 30 and 35, doing very well. So. That itself is leadership. Do not look at the position of the president or the governor, because at the end of the day, when it comes to job creation, it's not got money in government's hands or government. It's the private sector. That's where the jobs come from.
Absolutely.
That's where actually industrial development comes from. Government's role is to engender. Is to signal, is to
create that conducive environment,
and also to collaborate, because I can want to do business in Ghana as much as I want. If the laws do not permit the collaboration for those two countries to, really, and in terms of taxation, in terms of movement of goods and all that, that will keep me, stuck, where I am.
So Alan is giving a very interesting point over there, and so it's not like the youth of Africa are not lazy. They are very zealous. They are. They have the willpower. They want to build things for themselves if they're given that conducive environment to thrive. Zion, you've really touched on some very, very important fact here. So would you say that Africa needs a total overhaul in terms of the legal framework, to restructure the whole legal framework, or must we continue to build on what we're building? I mean, if you look at, from my perspective, most of the legal frameworks that we have in Africa was inherited from our colonizers. So there's a school of thought that might not necessarily be what Africa needed to help us thrive. Perhaps we needed to have set our own laws, or constitutions that would have enabled us to thrive faster. What is your narrative on that? Do you think we need an overhaul, or we continue to restructure and build what's existing?
I think it's about facing the right direction with what you have. You can have, if you put on your suit and you drive your car towards, the beach, you're not going to work.
Absolutely.
This is where, we just have to start facing the right direction, because the blame game would never stop. A country like Nigeria, with all of its resources, was colonized for about 100 years. Now you could blame that, we have 100 years deficit too. But the tools you have today, we have to start from somewhere.
Absolutely.
And understand that, this is what we have. The brains, the innovation and everything will be coming from Africa in for the next 20 years. The average age in Africa, for example, is about 20 years. Europe is about 40 years.
Right.
That means something.
It does.
Nigeria, for example, 200 million. That's about a quarter of, Europe. That means the underdevelopment is an opportunity as well, because that means there's untapped economy that
Right.
can be developed with new technologies. With the oil and gas we have, especially gas, I feel gas is a transformational resource, and understanding that Nigeria's got, I mean, the whole of Africa's got a lot of gas. See what's happening in Namibia, Mozambique, and all that. That's where that collaboration can come to play, to ensure that a South Africa, for example, which is a thriving economy with potential externality for other, could be the hub for development across the continent. If the resources are there, gas in Mozambique, in Namibia, and Nigeria, how about having some sort of project that, government to government, have a development plan to put XYZ here, and if the American dream is made in China, why can't the South African one be made in Nigeria?
Absolutely.
And it works.
Right.
Trade collaboration actually works because you save a lot of wasted development.
Right.
What they say, white elephant projects. We do have a lot of that.
Yes.
In Africa, there's no reason why Uganda is proposing to spend billions, in refinery. Except there's a regional play, because that's not sufficient, and those resources could be used for more things that would have more developmental effects. So we do have to be more strategic. I think strategic management is a problem in Africa. Governments just do projects. The fact is, you just list a number of projects and you want to actualize. So what is the big play? What is the national play? What's the regional play? How does this all fit into, and what's the benefits in the long term? So just doing things for doing sake is perhaps one of the biggest problems, we have in African leadership. There's a content problem in terms of individuals as well. There is, and we must face that. We must be very honest with that. The youth are not looking up to anyone, and I think the development you see in the private sector of Nigeria is due to austerity, because growing up, you have to be your own power provider through generators. You have to do a borehole to get your
you're self-reliant on yourself now.
Yes, you have to, nothing is given to you, and then that's not how it had to be with the resources we have. But perhaps the youth are taking on the leadership of their spaces, and an aggregation of that perhaps will lead to a reborn Africa.
They're taking control of their destiny
Absolutely.
in their own hands.